So my name is Seth Hill. As Jenna mentioned, I'm a senior developer here at Aten Design Group. This webinar is about Drupal 11 and what I think you should know about the latest version. I've personally been working with Drupal since version 5, and I had to look this up. It came out in 2007, so Drupal's been part of my life for about 17 years now. Today, I'm going to be covering a few topics. We'll start with what's new in Drupal 11, discuss how to approach a Drupal 11 upgrade, talk about when you should upgrade to Drupal 11, and hopefully have plenty of time at the end to answer some of your questions. I'd like to start us off with a basic question. What is Drupal? And I think there are a few common answers to this question. A content management system is probably what most people would say. Some developers might say that it's an application framework. Site owners might call it a site building tool, or you might hear people say our website is Drupal. And I think it's all of these. For the purpose of our discussion today, I'd like you to think about Drupal as a system. It provides some standard pieces, things like content types, users and roles, taxonomies, and standard ways of connecting them to one another. But out of the box, it's sort of a jumble of pieces, and it requires putting those pieces together for it to be meaningful. With the blocks, you can turn them into a robot, a fairy castle, a fire station, a rocket, anything you can imagine. And Drupal is like that. You can use it to build a wide range of digital experiences. With that idea in mind, I'd like to talk about what's new in Drupal 11. A lot of the features that you'll see in 11.0 are what I would call developer focused, in that they'll mostly benefit people who are building or maintaining sites, and your end users won't necessarily notice anything different. But there are some features that can impact content administration. There's a new admin navigation and some cool new things in CK Editor like Markdown shortcuts. If you use Google Docs or Slack, you kind of already know how this works. Like if you start typing something like 1 period space, those tools automatically start creating a numbered list for you. CK Editor does that now and also supports other shortcuts like asterisks for bold or underscores for italics. If you're a heavy keyboard user like me, it just makes formatting content a lot more enjoyable. Here's an example of that new administration menu, and you'll see that it really matches the rest of the interface. If you're using the Gin admin theme, this is pretty similar, but now it's in core as an experimental module. And this has been a long time coming, and I'm really happy to see it. One Drupal 11 feature that I'm particularly excited about is recipes. Recipes are a way of packaging up configurations and settings that deliver a certain kind of functionality. For example, in Drupal 11 core, there are recipes for things like a basic content type, a document media type, and an editorial workflow. If you're familiar with installation profiles, these might be things you would normally expect to find there. Recipes are applied rather than installed, so they don't end up becoming a dependency of your site. And because of this, you don't get locked in. You can remove modules or update configuration without changing the original recipe. And if the recipe changes, it doesn't change your site unless you reapply it. And unlike configuration management in Drupal, recipes aren't all or nothing, meaning you can make recipes for very broad general functionality or something super specific. And because recipes are so flexible and they don't create dependencies to themselves, they can be easily combined or shared or adapted to fit your own needs. This is a screen grab of a recipe folder in Drupal core. These are, like I say, in core, and that's a great place to start looking at the files and getting familiar with them. The code here isn't super important, but what I want to talk about is the structure of the folders. In the recipes folder, you'll see others. The one like administrator role, there's one called article comment, and the one called article content type that I have expanded here. Within the article content type recipe folder, there's another folder for config. And these are the kinds of configuration items that you might see in something like a standard profile. Some of you are probably familiar with that. Within the recipe folder, there is a recipe.yaml file that has the recipe definition. It has the config folder that contains all of the configuration files that are needed to create, in this case, the article content type. And this would be things like the body and image fields, a form display, and a few view displays. For site owners, I think recipes are going to be really useful because it will make adding new features considerably faster. Because you can apply one or more recipes rather than having to build everything up yourself. And because recipes are shareable, you'll also be able to find recipes created by others. In fact, there's already a recipes cookbook page on Drupal.org with various site starter and functionality specific recipes. For Aten, we'll be able to use recipes to make recreating commonly needed features that our projects often require. For example, standing up our default single directory components, installing and configuring our QA service and module, and adding things like that. They'll allow us to also share our work with others in a way that doesn't bind them to all of the parts of our standard processes. Speaking of single directory components, that module is now stable in Drupal 11. And here we're using the term component as a piece of a web page that's modular and needs to be reusable. And these could be elements like an accordion, a call to action, banners, slideshows, generic building blocks of pages that will appear throughout your site. Single directory components are a way of organizing the files needed to display a single component, things like the Twig template, CSS, JavaScript, into a single folder, hence the name. If you follow the naming conventions, Drupal will automatically generate a library to combine all of these for you. And then when you add an SDC to a page, Drupal will load the CSS and JavaScript for the components automatically. It makes creating new components so much easier and faster. And SDCs also make changing the HTML that Drupal outputs much easier, or in some cases even possible. And then because single directory components are essentially self-contained, it's fairly easy to reuse them across different entity types, things like paragraphs or custom block types, or even across different projects. They might need to do some theme work, but the basic functionality kind of all comes over in one folder. And here's a screen grab of a component folder. And again, the specific code isn't so important for our discussion, but what I want to point out is the names of the files within the accordion component folder. And because they're named following the convention, accordion.component.yaml, accordion.css, accordion.js, accordion.twig, Drupal will automatically look for these anytime the accordion component is rendered on a page. So we don't have to create a specific library for that and remember to keep that updated. The Twig template that's on the right side of the screen also shows how we can more radically change the output from Drupal. If you've used older versions of Drupal, it's kind of divs within divs, inside of divs, inside of divs. And we can replace that now with markup that is semantic, it is accessible, and also can be more easily maintained by a front-end developer. Single directory components make the implementation or integration of design systems a lot easier too, because you can more easily change Drupal's output to match whatever structure is in there. It should make collaboration between front and back end developers a lot smoother. Front end can concentrate on what it does best, and that work is much easier to implement on the back end. In some cases, a back end developer might not even be needed. Aten standardized on the single directory component approach in Drupal 10, and we've been using this for almost all of our client projects for quite some time now. We are continuing to look for places to further integrate single directory components with Mercury Editor, which is Aten's drag and drop page editor for Drupal. I'm going to let this video play for a minute or so in the background. It's a recording of a user who is building out a page with components. And these are all single directory components using Mercury Editor. And you can see they are dragging and dropping components around, changing some of the appearance of those layouts, things like that. And I want to be clear that Mercury Editor is Aten's solution to page building. It isn't a requirement for using Drupal 11. It isn't a requirement for single directory components, and it's not a requirement for working with us. I think the video is a good illustration of how components can drive the content administration and why we're excited that single directory components are now stable in core. Also stable in Drupal 11 is the Workspaces module. Workspaces allow you to create multiple copies of your live site. And within these copies, you can work on changes like content edits or structural changes, and then deploy those changes to the live workspace. You might want to do things like testing out menu changes, completely reorganize a section of the site, or maybe you have seasonal content that all needs to go live at the same time. You could work on those within a new workspace or in multiple workspaces. And then when those changes are ready to go live, they happen all at once. This concept is similar to dev and test sites within your hosting environments. This is like the content equivalent of that. But it is very different in one aspect, which is that the workspaces are all created within a single environment, which is probably your live or prod environment. Here's an example of what managing a workspace looks like. At the top of the screen, I have my live workspace with the green icon and 3 others, Aten Webinar, Stage, and the workspace I'm currently working in, Autumn Changes. Within the Autumn Changes workspace, I've created a couple of article nodes, and those nodes have menu links. I can deploy those changes into the live workspace by clicking the Publish Content button at the top right. And this seems great, right? But I have some pretty significant warnings that I'll talk about in just a moment. I think workspaces could be powerful because it allows working on changes to a site and previewing those changes without affecting the live environment. And you can do that now with individual pages using content moderation and workflow. But it's always been hard to work on a big set of changes over time and preview them before publishing. Workspaces endeavors to make that more possible. And then when you're satisfied with everything, you can publish it all at once. I've experimented with workspaces in the past and also with this stable release. And although I think this is a fantastic idea, even with a relatively simple test site, I encountered some challenges with implementation. For example, I couldn't create a new page with paragraphs within a workspace, and I couldn't move some menus around. I also found that there were some, I think, serious usability issues. Like I said, I couldn't fully do something like a menu reorganization. And in my experience, that's one of the few tasks that content administrators are always asking for. And then I also couldn't uninstall it, and now I have to rebuild one of my local dev sites. If you're already doing anything with content moderation, layouts, translations. My gut feeling is that Workspaces is going to be a real battle to get working, just because of the added layers of complexity. And it will probably require a lot of training and continued support to get your content administrators familiar with it and comfortable working within its limitations. So I'd say given the types of sites that we work on at Aten, we'll probably avoid this module for now and stick with our typical content moderation approach. And I would say unless you have a fully supported use case and have the resources for the added overhead, you'll probably want to avoid it for now too. Access Policy API is a new API that allows you to give or take away permissions based on some sort of context. And this would be something more than you can do with roles because it can be more granular and targeted than roles can. Permissions can be combined on a set of conditions, which means that you can tailor them to a specific user or content or certain circumstances. I think in most cases, roles and usual Drupal permissions are going to be enough, and the use cases for access policies are going to be highly specific. So if you're doing something like this now, it's almost certainly in custom code, and access policy API is just going to give us a way of standardizing some of those tasks. So access policy will let site owners manage permissions granularly and programmatically based on context and conditions. For Aten, it's not so much that we couldn't do this kind of thing before Drupal 11, but I could see an opportunity for us to standardize our approach to controlling permissions on certain kinds of projects. I'm thinking things like maybe an intranet where you might have 1,000 different combinations of permissions based on some attributes or conditions. And obviously creating that many roles would be totally unmanageable. This might also be useful for something like walled content where you let users see 5 free articles a month or at certain times of the day if they don't have a subscription. I'll take a moment to talk briefly about Drupal CMS, which you may have heard referred to as Starshot. I can almost hear you saying now, like, I thought Drupal was a CMS. And going back to that earlier notion of Drupal being a larger system, you can think of Drupal CMS as representing that familiar and typical content management scenario. One goal is to improve the initial experience interacting with Drupal, possibly even to a point that a user could create a presentable, usable, and accessible website directly in the UI with concepts like recipes, project browser, and automatic updates. It should eliminate obstacles for entry for DIY builders and marketers. And when I say DIY, I don't mean amateurs, I mean people who are literally comfortable doing that kind of work. But then also those who are newer to Drupal. For site owners, Drupal CMS will reduce the need for expert developers for certain kinds of projects and get those projects to launch faster. For Aten in general, I think our projects are the kind where there are specific needs, and we're still going to be doing a lot of custom development. Our clients oftentimes don't build or maintain full-on sites on their own, and giving more freedom to their users might not actually be the best idea. So for now, I'd say we're waiting to see how Starshot plays out, and especially looking for ways to weave concepts into our own processes that we've refined and shifted around as Drupal has evolved. Let's talk now about how to approach upgrading to Drupal 11. I'll start with a brief history of Drupal upgrades. In early versions of Drupal, and by early, I mean Drupal 8 and earlier, a new version really meant building something from the ground up. The code from the existing site wasn't especially reusable. Knowing the content and the fields and taxonomy certainly made development easier, but the code itself changed quite a bit. We might have called these upgrades in the past, but I'd consider them more to be migrations. And often, because it was so much work to build in a new version of Drupal, you'd wait until you did a full site redesign before taking all of that on. And this made timing a real challenge. Say you needed a new site. You maybe knew Drupal 7 was on its way, but the release date wasn't too clear yet. You were faced with a choice. You could either delay your project until the new version came out, or move ahead with the project in the older version, knowing that inevitably, as soon as you launched, Drupal 7 would be released and you were stuck with the old model. Things changed in Drupal 8 when Drupal was built on top of Symfony, which is a framework for PHP. The details of that aren't terribly important, but the main point is that we would now keep the same underlying code base from version to version. And that might not seem like an important distinction, but it also meant that the same modules that worked in Drupal 8 would work in later versions, more or less. And this allowed a much more predictable release schedule and life cycle for sites, which I'll explain later. Starting with that Drupal 8 to 9 upgrade, you no longer had to do a total rebuild. You could do what I'd call in-place upgrades, which, I mean, you could more or less upgrade Drupal core without having to touch the modules and the theme and the rest of the site. Because of that, your project requirements and the modules you were using were more of a consideration now than the version of Drupal core itself. So the exact timing of your upgrade to Drupal 9, Drupal 10, Drupal 11, and so on became less important. Obviously, every site is going to be unique. It's going to have its own requirements and idiosyncrasies. And so this is a very high level outline of steps involved in a Drupal upgrade. And even though an upgrade from Drupal 10 to 11 is relatively less effort than, say, going from Drupal 6 to 7, you still need to plan it out. If you have a site that has a ton of contrib modules, modules that aren't well supported, or complicated custom modules, it's going to take longer. Planning the upgrade will take longer, and actually doing the upgrade will take longer. There's a module called upgrade status that can help with this process. With it, you can assess if your modules have D11 ready versions. It can help identify changes that are needed in custom code, and it can also make general recommendations on what to do about modules that don't have Drupal 11 support. Just be sure to run that on dev or locally, because the reports can take hours to complete and you don't want to impact your live site. This is also a really great time to look at the modules you're using and identify any that could be removed or replaced with something newer and better. In the past, we were sort of forced to do this because of that whole rebuild aspect. So I think now it's just a good time to go through and tidy things up as much as you can. And don't forget about build and CI tools. I am guilty of doing this myself. I got excited to push out a change only to find out that my builds are now failing, and now I need to upgrade Node and the whole testing suite. And maybe that thing that we were putting off now has to be done. Then you'll have to perform the upgrades, and I wrote upgrades in plural here because I think it works best as a set of at least 2 upgrades, maybe a couple of more in some cases. The first thing you'll want to do is ensure that the new platform requirements are satisfied. And this could mean some extra work if you are responsible for maintaining your own web servers and not using a common hosting platform. So just make sure you're aware of those. I think it generally works well to first update your modules and test to make sure that everything is working as expected. Module changes are frequently where regressions or errors are going to come up. And so upgrading those to versions that are compatible with both Drupal 10 and 11 will give you plenty of time to test, and it will help isolate some of those variables. And just a note, it's sometimes not entirely possible to do that. But as much as you can get there, I think the better off you'll be. And then you'll want to do a separate deployment to update Drupal core and any of those straggling modules itself. Um, this will depend heavily on the complexity of your code and your operations, but I think it's reasonable to expect that the development timeline will be measured in hours or days. If you have something like an e-commerce site where the risk and impact of downtime is high, or you have a super complicated custom code base, it could take days, maybe even some weeks. But if you have a very simple site, it can probably be done in an afternoon. Okay, congratulations, you did it. You've upgraded to Drupal 11. Good job. Uh, I think there are probably a range of reactions that you can expect. If all you're doing is updating Drupal core, that's not really going to change the experience or look and feel of anything. You're actually happy that nothing looks different, nothing has changed. Your end users might not even know. If you do the update later and you're able to use some of the new features like the new admin navigation, your users may notice some small improvements. And I think really much, much more is to come in Drupal 11. And I think that's why it's important to do the upgrade and stay current. Now that you know about Drupal 11 and what's involved in upgrading, let's talk about when you should upgrade to Drupal 11. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Drupal lifecycle and how all of this fits together. So here we are in mid to late 2024. Drupal 10.3 is out and it's receiving active support. When 10.4 is released around the beginning of next year, Drupal 10 will be in what's called maintenance support, which means that select changes from Drupal 11 will be backported down to Drupal 10. But really at this point, Drupal 11 is the development focus. Around the end of 2025, Drupal will enter a period where it receives only security updates, and it will reach end of life in mid-2026 when Drupal 12 is released. I do want to talk a little bit about what happens at the end of life in Drupal. It sounds ominous, but your site will continue to function. It's not like a license that expires and suddenly your site stops working. But there are no more bug fixes to your installed Drupal core, and most critically, there are no more security updates. Contrib module maintainers have probably focused on the newer versions, and so they're not really paying much attention to updating for Drupal 10. And all of this just means that upgrading later takes more effort because there's more and more and more that has to be addressed as time goes on. Let's turn our attention to Drupal 11. 11.0 was just released, and Drupal 11 will be receiving active development support until around 2027 when it goes into that maintenance support like I described earlier. There will also be a security update only portion and an end of life for that too. Putting all of this together and adding in the Drupal 12 lifecycle, I think 2025 is going to be the right time for most people to upgrade to Drupal 11. And again, this is a big generalization. If you have a simpler site and all of your contrib and custom modules are ready to go in Drupal 11, there's no harm in doing it sooner. But I think for most larger sites, it's best to let contrib modules catch up, let the community work out some of the kinks in the new version, and then do the upgrade. And now that Drupal is on a more steady and predictable release schedule, you can start getting people really excited about Drupal 12 in 2027. So to summarize, in Drupal 11, the new features are focused on development and administration, but there is a lot more to come. Recipes allow packaging and sharing site functions, configuration, and settings. Single directory components are a way of grouping and using templates, CSS, and JavaScript. Workspaces allow previewing sets of site edits and performing bulk updates of content. But I think Workspaces will probably break your heart, so you'll want to stay away from that for a bit. Access policy API gives us new ways of programmatically setting permissions. As an approach, you'll want to plan to upgrade to Drupal 11 when your contrib and custom modules are ready and supported. Make sure you set aside time to plan the Drupal 11 upgrade, especially if your site and tooling are complex. The development time will vary, probably measured in hours to days, and then do those updates to modules first, and then update the core separately. In terms of timing, I think this is, again, big generalization, upgrade to Drupal 11 in 2025 and get ready for Drupal 12 in 2027. And so with that, I think that's the end of my presentation. Aten, of course, would love for you to get in touch with us via our website or the email address work@aten.io.